I feel a little intrepidation about this talk. I wanted to say that. And for several reasons, and I'm giving it because I feel personally I need it, and to keep giving this talk almost every retreat. And also it's a difficult talk to give, and in some ways, and liberating in others. And you're probably thinking, what is she going to talk about that she's saying this? When, as we've lifted up our love and our love of Sangha, I also wanted to lift up the places where we get caught and where we need support as communities to address. And how to link what the Buddha teaches about where we get caught with the ways we get culturally and structurally caught. So, caught, or how we find ourselves unconsciously playing out dynamics of oppression with each other in our sanghas, because we play those dynamics out wherever we live and whoever we're in relationship with. And each one of us inhabits different locations. So before I go on to the details of how that interlinks with the teachings of this lineage or of the Dharma in relationship to this, let me back up now. I was just like creating a field of maybe not such an easy flow of in the Dharma talk, but feeling so committed to wanting to keep on building an understanding with us and supporting each of us in this work. And so let me begin again with the foundational understanding and wisdom that we've been naming through all these days, and that is that the beautiful qualities live inside of us in an unlimited way, not always awakened fully, but that they're there and they're living inside of us, and that they can't be destroyed. So it's like, no matter how long a room has been in the dark, when you put on a light, it stops being dark. And there's a very traditional story, and I was going to use some more current ones, and then I was like, oh, enough of naming what we know already has been going on in our world. So I'm going to use a very traditional story of a man called Angulimala, who, through bad advice from a family member, entered into a rampage of killing, and he killed 999 people. He was fearless in the killing. He was in such a rampage of wanting to kill. And he would like go from village to village, and people would hear through the grapevine he was coming, and they would split the scene. They would run away because they'd heard that he had killed all these people, and that he really in a way didn't care about himself. He was just killing, killing, killing. And the Buddha happened to be walking in a village where Angulimala was coming towards, and they heard about it, and they said to the Buddha, "Oh, come on, we better run and hide." Maybe they didn't say that exactly, because that's our lingo, but the equivalent. And they split the scene, actually, and the Buddha continued to walk. And Angulimala came upon him, and the Buddha used his psychic powers, so Angulimala couldn't catch him. And the Buddha continued this for a while, and Angulimala got really frustrated because he wanted to kill the Buddha. And he said, "Stop." And the Buddha turned around and said, "I have, it's you who haven't." And the power of the Buddha naming that actually awakened him. And he realized in that moment that he had been on the wrong path. And so there and then he bowed down and said, "Will you take me into your Sangha?" And the Buddha said yes. And I love the story because there have been times in my own life where I have felt hopeless about myself and my own mind when I was young. And there's something beautiful about the story illuminating that in a way it doesn't matter, not that it doesn't matter, that no matter how much harm we've created, there is this capacity to stop and to awaken. And so this is a testament to no matter where we are, what we feel, what we've done, and I certainly have broken almost all the precepts except taking the life of another human being. And I fantasized about doing that against some of the perpetrators of violence I experienced. So this story really feels like a important naming of this unlimited capacity to stop and to open to those beautiful qualities whenever we find the right conditions and support and inner strength to do that. And for me, those right conditions were Ruth Denison, my teacher. And part of the right conditions for me was that I knew she also had experienced a lot of violence in her life. As a prisoner of war, I won't go through all the details, but she experienced a lot of violence. And I didn't always trust teachers who hadn't experienced that, because I felt like, well, it's all very well for you to talk about love or forgiveness or mindfulness even. You haven't gone through what I've gone through. And she had. And so she was one of the conditions that enabled me to begin to open and trust. That even though I'd experienced so much and had hated so much, that I too could maybe open to the teachings of the Dharma. So here I am, in the stream of the Dharma with you. And sometimes it feels like an incredible blessing and also a miracle. And one of the things that's been very helpful for me, given some of my own history, is to be really very detailed in the understanding and analysis of, well, what happens when I'm caught in some of the trauma that rises inside of myself or that acts itself out? What is going on? And so I wanted to take some time to go through a little bit of that and use the teachings of dependent origination as a framework. One of these streams is beautiful that lives inside of us. We could call it a neural network. And then there's another stream that is the stream that is rooted in ignorance, and we have spoken about that. And so just a reminder that whenever there is something that is conditioned towards suffering and oppression or not liberation, it always springs from ignorance. And so then what is this factor? Because actually it's hugely important. It is the spring of all suffering. It is the quality of mind that does not know. So it's actually the opposite of mindfulness. And it is experienced as confusion, as not knowing, as being in a fog. Say we were on a mountainside hiking and we just could not discern where we are, what the geography was, what is happening, which way is up, which way is down, how to actually even know how to go back the way we came. That kind of confusion, that there's just, like using the simile of no sense of direction, and therefore no place to orient towards what is skillful and wholesome and liberating. So it's this total confusion. And remember that I named that there were 3 other factors that always arose with ignorance. And so remember, one was there's no fear in harming. So a fearlessness that means no remorse or caring in harming. And both through speech and action and thinking, that two of those that cover the 3 expressions. And then lastly, there's that restlessness or anxiety where the mind can't settle, so there's no capacity to drop and penetrate in to what's happening. Out of this field, when ignorance is arising inside of us, comes the psychological experience of being rootless, of not fitting in, which is one of the definitions of suffering or dukkha in this lineage, which is that the axle doesn't fit properly into the wheel. So the wheel keeps slipping, like there's no connection and no sense of fitting in, of being part of something. And, you know, it could be that it's like where we grew up in our family, but there was some place where it's like, oh, I don't really belong in my family. Or at school, like I'm so different than everyone at school. Or I have lots of friends, but I really feel existentially lonely. Or I feel inadequate. No matter what I achieve, I always feel inadequate or insufficient or not good enough. And you get the sort of sense of the psychological experience of ignorance. And out of this field of no anchor and no connection and confusion, then comes the habitual and automatic response, very understandably, given this reality we're experiencing, or not real, this experience, the movement to reach out and to grasp whatever will alleviate this real suffering, actually. And so there's this movement out to grasp at anything, but mostly what's pleasant. And it's because we want to find anything that we can rest in, and pleasant things are a place where we can rest. And in a way, if the world was constructed to always be pleasant, then there would be no need for liberatory teachings. Well, there would be, but we wouldn't be so moved to them because everything was pleasant. And the Buddha actually said that being born a human being is exactly the right place to be born, to want access to the Dharma. Because if we happen to be born in exceptionally very pleasant circumstances, and in Buddhism there's a whole cosmology that might sound alien, but there's like these different realms that, you know, psychics like Seth and all these, Emmanuel and all these psychics, well, they are communicating to some of these energies in other realms. Well, the teachings acknowledge these other realms, and some of them are exquisitely pleasant. And when I did a retreat with U Pandita, a Burmese teacher, he spent 3 days talking about how pleasant these heavenly realms were, and I'm like, wow. and then he would say, they're not conducive for liberation. And at some point, all these devas in these realms are going to have to come back down to earth again and experience suffering. So anyway, that's a little side path. So pleasant experiences don't last. And so then we're constantly on this wheel of reaching for whatever it is, the combination of things: food, clothes, shopping, sex, alcohol, drugs, whatever we feel compulsive around, controlling our environment. And it could even be intellectual pursuits. I mean, it's whatever it is that becomes an object to alleviate this kind of suffering. And the reality is, and we know this already, is that there is no healing and liberation in this dynamic. And the Buddha was so clear about that, and he named that in the second noble truth. So the first truth is there's suffering, yeah, no news for us there. The second noble truth is that there's a cause of suffering, and the cause of suffering is this confusion and the reaching out to try and heal it or escape it by fixating on pleasant experiences and pushing away unpleasant experiences. And I remember when I was a smoker, you know, there were times when I ran out of cigarettes, and it would be like, 1 a.m. in the morning, and I would be walking down the street for 20 minutes to the nearest town, Kentish Town, in London, this is, to the cigarette machine, because there used to be cigarette machines, to buy cigarettes. Just like I have to get my fix. So, and just like I cannot not do that. So that compulsive urge to alleviate the psychological experiences of dislocation and disconnection. And it feels quite liberating to acknowledge, and we have already, but in a spiritual practice to acknowledge, oh, this isn't the way or path to well-being and happiness. And that doesn't mean to say that pleasant experiences are bad, but just that the answer isn't to try and collect them and control them, because they're changing all the time. And that there is another way. So I want to then go into a tiny bit more detail, because any time in the mind that there is ignorance, this whole cycle of reaching out for something and trying to fix it takes place. But it's not only that we are reaching out for pleasant experiences, there is a whole identity that gets constructed around it. So, I just came up with an example. So I went to a university in London, and at the university, universities there were not so many people accessed university when I was growing up in London in the 60s and 70s. And there was a lot of elitism in the university. Like, when we're learning something, we were learning the words and the concepts to define things in such a way that made us important and more important than people who didn't have an education. Like, it wasn't just that we were creating a field of knowledge. Within that activity, we were also creating inequality by learning to identify as a particular type of person who went to university and used words and language to construct a reality that wasn't inclusive. And that's what the dynamic of elitism is. And I caught it a little bit in the question and answer period this morning. You all shared so beautifully, and then I came in and I said, I just want to name this more formally. That was elitism. You already had named it so beautifully. I certainly didn't need to step in and do it in that particular way. Like using a language, I used the Dharma language in this case, but it was that sense of languaging something in a particular way that becomes exclusive, or that communicates, oh, I've been in the Dharma a long while. And the funny thing is, I could feel it a little bit. I could feel it a little bit in that moment of being very exhausted from not sleeping for a few nights and a little disconnected. So that's the example of the ways that the ignorance of I don't feel sufficient in my being, and so I am going to suck in and identify with anything that makes me a little special, that makes me more visible and more seen. And I notice when I'm in particular situations that I will, just language things in a particular way in order to be seen. Yeah. This happens around sexism and the ways that people born into male bodies are offered more visibility, are seen more, are supported more, are even like in my family when we didn't have a lot of money after we immigrated, where my father always got most of, much more of the food, like just all kinds of ways where people in male bodies have been traditionally lifted up. And then the opposite, where in classrooms putting up your hand and you're not seen, or even in going to teachers' conference, Dharma teachers' conferences. And I think I mentioned it, men dominating, men talking, and each, just like one man after the other. And I'm like, whoa, this is heavy. But that's that. I understand that movement to inhabit that place without even knowing that I'm doing it. I mean, that understanding has come much later, because it's very pleasant. It's very pleasant to be acknowledged and lifted up and supported and to be given access. Or when you come into a shop, especially an auto shop, you're noticed. You can open your mouth and people really listen to you. Just as one small recent example. So we are all doing that according to our privileged locations. If you happen to be between the ages of 22 and 45, you are more visible than someone in their 70s and 80s with gray hair or younger. Or if you are not Jewish, or if you are a person who has English as their first language, or if you happen to be middle class or upper middle class or upper class. All these conditions, if you're white, all these conditions have given us visibility and support in these particular areas. And I want to say that it's much easier to notice where we haven't been given this in our target locations than to notice where we have, because it's been so normalized. It's so conditioned in this mental state of ignorance that we don't realize that we're operating out of it and sustaining it in our relationships. So I think I've given this example before, but in my last marriage, I married someone who came from a very poor working class background. And she used to say to me, "You always have all the power in the relationship." And I'm like, I don't have the power in our relationship. Like, we're equal. And it took years to get the impact of my class background and the ways that I used my class background and education to define what was going on in our relationship in ways that disempowered her. And I did not know I was doing that. Even when she said it, it took going to class consciousness workshops that I started to understand what I was doing. Or recently, I spoke to a good friend who said to me, I felt really uncomfortable when we went out to a restaurant in XYZ. And I said, why? She said, well, you just asked the waiter to take your wine back and give you a new glass of wine. And I felt really uncomfortable that you did that. And I was like, hey, I feel it's my right, not that I said those words, but that was the feeling, to send the wine back if I didn't feel like it was good enough. And she comes from a working class background, and she would never do that. She felt really uncomfortable. So just naming the ways that we unconsciously move through the world. Not that it's right or wrong, but just that there's not a lot of awareness in it. And there's certainly, like honestly, is a lot of space in whatever community we're in for us to learn and grow and become more aware of the different ways this dynamic of ignorance plays out in our privileged locations. And then to particularly mark that it's always easier to go to the target location than the privileged one. So I have been in sanghas with white men who speak about how they were bullied in the playground and how hard it was for them to actually situate themselves in their privilege as white males, heterosexual males. And that was such a teaching for me to look at the places where it's so easy for me to talk about my target experiences and the violence I've experienced, and not so easily talk about my privileged location as a white, semi-middle class, educated, English as a first language, relatively able-bodied woman. And it's and the privileged location is more difficult because in our target location it's so clear, because it's so painful, that there's more awareness. But in the privileged location there's less awareness, and there's less awareness because when there's ignorance in the mind, the first contact of that we perceive through ears, eyes, nose, mouth, that first contact is not neutral. It's already distorted by ignorance. So ignorance at the very beginning of perception, at the very beginning of what we hear, whenever we hear anything, or what we see, if we can see, I should say, and if we hear, or what we smell, or what we taste, or what we think, it's never neutral. It's always distorted by ignorance when ignorance is in the mind. The ignorance actually changes how we perceive something or how we don't. So it might be that this was a story of that I heard some friends say, that they were walking down the road and that some of them did not see homeless people on the street because that ignorance just discarded, because homeless people are important, that they were there on the street. And then, of course, we know that the kind of access that we have, the benefits we have in our privileged location, the unearned benefits we have, the visibility we have, we then rarely get to defend by making other people invisible. And even more than that, we get to defend it through the state justice system, through the police, and the police sustaining inequity through violence. And individually, how does that work? Individually, it works that anyone who's challenging that privilege, that what feels like hard-earned privilege, is a danger. And in our location, there is always some kind of defense. If there wasn't, we wouldn't be acting out our privilege. So when I understand, when, like, my father was tortured in jail, and now I understand that fear, the fear of, these people who are fighting apartheid are going to challenge the kind of ease of how I live, having an apartheid system where every white family has servants, and it's, it was very comfortable for the majority of white people in South Africa, and anti-apartheid activists, or it didn't matter what their skin color was or who they were rarely seen as the enemy of the state. And I grew up with people who were murdered by the police. And I know that you all have too, maybe. I understand that because that dynamic is also inside me, in my privileged location. Not so unaware, but it's still there, of defending what I have, unconsciously, by the ways that I just spoke in. It's very subtle, but it's the same thing. And it comes from misperceiving reality. So where there's contact, there's already ignorance. And in that ignorance, then, when a pleasant feeling comes up, then it's grasped onto, or an unpleasant feeling pushed away. Like, I don't like this wine, send it back. And then the craving and the holding on to what's pleasant. And in that, the sort of entitlement grows, or the becoming grows into an identity of, I am someone who expects good wine. I am someone who is protecting America from refugees because I don't want them to take what I have. So, when we take refuge in the Sangha, we're taking refuge in this inquiry and this work of, is there any way that I am contributing to sustaining inequity or invisibility? Yes, I am. And I have been, I and we are in a learning process around that, if we really want to challenge those structures in our communities and in our intimate relationships. And, and if it was easy, then everyone would be doing it, but it isn't easy, because we're challenging the places where we've built an identity. And it takes a lot of courage to be willing to face that. Having said that, the desire to unlock and disentangle from that dynamic is the desire to be free, is to orient towards a different way of living that actually builds well-being and happiness, that is respectful and kind and caring. And so I really want to lift up us as a Sangha, sharing and talking about our experiences, and to support that whenever something doesn't feel right. And so then in honor of that, I would like to read this, just to acknowledge the privilege as a white South African woman. I acknowledge that I lived on the sacred sovereign, that I live now on the sacred sovereign land of the Serrano, Kawila, Chenawevi, and Mojave tribes. I acknowledge that the sovereignty has never been ceded, and I pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and future, and to all indigenous peoples. I acknowledge that I am an occupier. I come from a history of occupiers who have yet to reconcile with the people of the land they have occupied. I acknowledge that my ancestors, with ignorance and insensitivity and brutality, illegally occupied the land of the Khoisan people of South Africa. I acknowledge that I grew up treading on the sacred land without knowledge or awareness, blind to my cultural damage to the First Peoples. I acknowledge that in my adult years, I have arrogantly thought I knew better, blind to my white privilege. I acknowledge that my success is built on the struggle of dispossessed others. I acknowledge that as yet my culture continues to deny this fact and remains blind to the effects of colonization and intergenerational trauma on indigenous peoples to this day. I acknowledge that the pain, grief, and loss of land and language that my culture is responsible for is reflected in our country's identity. I acknowledge and take responsibility for my people's ignorance, racism, and cruelty. On behalf of myself and my ancestors, I offer heartfelt apology. I commit to being open and humble, and always respecting the knowledge and wisdom of the first peoples of this land. I stand for a future of shared mutual respect and partnership with peoples of this country and the world. And then from my favorite poet, this is one of the poems that I read in every retreat, for calling the spirit back from wandering the earth in its human feet. Oh, but let me stop for a moment. I think I want to acknowledge in reading that accountability statement. I want to acknowledge the challenge and cost of fighting the system, of accounting for and fighting the system. So then, for calling the spirit back from wandering the earth in its human feet. Put down the bag of potato chips, the white bread, the bottle of pop. Turn off the cell phone, computer, and remote control. Open the door, then close it behind you. Take a breath offered by the friendly winds. They travel the earth, gathering essence of plants to clean. Give it back with gratitude. If you sing, it will give your spirit lift to fly to the stars, ears, and back. Acknowledge this earth who has cared for you since you were a dream, planting itself precisely within your parents' desire. Let your moccasined feet take you to the encampment of the guardians who have known you before time and who will be there after time. They sit before the fire that has been there without time. Let the earth stabilize your post-colonial jitters. Be respectful of the small insects, birds, and animal people who accompany you. Ask their forgiveness for the harm we humans have brought upon them. Don't worry. The heart knows the way through, though there might be high-rises, interstates, checkpoints, armed soldiers, massacres, wars, and those who will despise you because they despise themselves. The journey might take you a few hours, a day, a year, a few years, 100,000, even more. Watch your mind. Without training, it might run away and leave your heart for the immense human feast set by the thieves of time. Do not hold regrets. When you find your way to the circle, to the fire kept burning by the keepers of your soul, you will be welcomed. You must clean yourself with cedar, sage, or other healing plants. Cut the ties you have to failure and shame. Let go of the pain you're holding in your mind, your shoulders, your heart, all the way to your feet. Let go of the pain of your ancestors to make way for those who are heading in our direction. Ask for forgiveness. Call upon the help of those who love you. These helpers take many forms: animal, element, bird, angel, saint, stone, or ancestor. Call your spirit back. It may be caught in corners and creases of shame, judgment, and human abuse. You must call in a way that your spirit will want to return. Speak to it as though you would to a beloved child. Welcome your spirit back from its wandering. It may return in pieces, in tatters. Gather them together. They will be happy to be found after being lost for so long. Your spirit will need to sleep a while after it's bathed and been given clean clothes. Now you can have a party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place to go. Make a giveaway, and remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark. Let's take a moment to sit together without words. Up, lie down or stand. Or recline. liberated from oppression and from oppressing. May we be free.